Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. How are you all doing? Welcome back to the Kev Baker Show with me, your host, Kev Baker. And tonight I'm joined by my good friend and co-host, Mr. Johnny Whistles. Now, before we get right into it, no wasting any time tonight, I want to thank all of you out there. And the reason I'm thanking all of you is because tonight's guest was totally unbeknown to me until he got in touch with me. And now I've just found out that basically, thanks to all of you people out there pestering this brilliant man, he got in touch with me. And tonight's show is going ahead right now. More about our guest in just a moment. But Johnny Whistles, how are you doing? And are you looking forward to a show that's going to raise the bar right here on KBS?
Yes, I sure am, Kev. And actually, there's another person today who I met when I told her about our guest and what he was going into. And her name is Ethel. She's a teacher, teaching young kids. And she is really, really looking forward to this tonight, as we are, Kev.
Excellent stuff, Johnny. So without wasting any time tonight, if you head on into the Wookiee Cave, give them their shout out and we will get right into it.
I'm in there just now, Kev. 40 people in the tinfoil hat area as we speak. Thanks very much, everyone, again, for turning up in numbers. We start with the number one in red. We've got Lucky. We've got Alex Mendez, Bill Demarest, Brendan O'Shea, Calvin Long, Charles Calvo, Chris Smith, Darryl Bowles, Diane Rapper, Ed J. We've got Jeff Phillips, Helen Coward, Itherian, James Millward, James Webster. We've got Jan Simpson. We've got Jason Flaherty. We've got Joy Williams, Kat Landry, Kenneth Webb, our brother. We've got Kenny Robinson, Lof Stewart, Michelle Smith, Lynn Metcalf. We've got Nancy Lalonde, Peter Collins, Reg Legill, Sam Ramirez, Sean Barraclough, Surfer 38, Sharon McDaniel Cornwall, Simon Wilkins. We've got Spears Buddy, Stephen Gray, Stephen Basco. New name in there. We've got Thomas Silk, Time Lord, Tony Phillips, and then last but not least, Kev, number 42, Unconfirmed Truth.
Awesome stuff. And a big shout out to a musician, Wendy Goulden, who I know will be absolutely loving all of this. She's been pestering me for a guest about the Nephilim, and tonight, oh boy, have we got it. Now, during our time on the Kev Baker Show, there are subjects that keep coming up. Stuff like the Nephilim, the giants, bloodlines, DNA manipulation, and how it all relates to the end times. And at some point, you will undoubtedly have heard all of us saying, as in the times of Noah. But what does that even mean? Well, tonight we are joined by Gary Wayne, the author of The Genesis 6 Conspiracy. Gary is a Christian contrarian who has maintained a lifelong love affair with biblical prophecy, history, and mythology. His extensive study has encompassed the Holy Bible, the Gnostic scriptures, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, Gilgamesh, and other ancient epics, language etymology, and secret society publications. And that is why I'm so excited and thrilled to bring Gary Wayne onto the Kev Baker Show. Welcome to the show, sir.
So happy to be here, and thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to a stimulating conversation tonight, and I think once we get into some of these things that your audience is going to have their curiosity raised and probably maybe even have more questions because we're not going to get through all of it, but I think they're going to be very, very interested in what we're going to talk about.
Oh, absolutely, Gary. And let me just ask you, I mean, what led you into writing this book in the first place?
Well, and it's a large book, so it's for me, it's kind of a humorous story. I mean, I've got about 15 or 20 books I've kind of got in my head I want to write, and so I thought I wanted to write my easiest, shortest book first and just sort of cut my craft on that and see whether or not I could actually get published and learn the trade of writing. And so I decided I'd pick up on this sort of curiosity I had where we've got, because I'm a prophecy buff, and so I looked at these giants that are talked about in Genesis 6, and then they keep coming up after the flood. And then I look at end-time prophecy in the New Testament. We've got demons coming out of the abyss and demon-like frogs coming out and leading people to war. You've got the fallen angels coming back to the earth, and you've got Jesus talking about the times, the end times, and his second coming are going to reflect the times of Noah. And so I wanted to connect that. So I thought I'd write a short little book, but somewhere on the path to the Colosseum, this turned into probably the largest book I'll ever write. But certainly a passion of more love than anything, because it involved so many of my passions in life that, I just kept opening more doors and opening more doors. So that was why I decided to write the book. One was just to write a short book, which I didn't do, and the second thing was to connect Genesis 6 with the end time.
And something I really appreciate about your research, as I was sharing with you before the show, is the fact that you have gone across so many ancient scriptures, so many different tales and mythology, and you've managed to connect the dots, because so many times we see researchers maybe just concentrating on the Bible alone. But what's it been like actually looking across this broad spectrum, Gary? Is it the same story we hear all over?
Well, that's the amazing thing, is that when you get into whether or not it's in, continental India's religion and history, or you get into the native North American legends, or you get into the Gnostic scriptures, or you get into the Quran, or you get into Greek mythology, or you get into Atlantis, or you get into Sumerian mythology with the Anunnaki, you quickly learn that they're all telling almost an identical story, but from a different perspective, a vernacular and a polytheist perspective as to what a Christian would look at it from a monotheist perspective. But they're describing the same events. And all of a sudden you learn that there is a common history into prehistory. There's a common legacy. There's a common sort of understanding of what happened before records were kept and what happened thereafter. But nobody wants to recognize that, let alone within the Christian church, which is one of the reasons why I'm a contrarian, or outside the Christian church into secular science and secular society. They all want to shelve the connections here, because I think it's either a realization that they would scare the heck out of everybody that's out there, or they're manipulating the information to keep us from knowing what really happened in the times in prehistory, because what's coming in the end time is so directly connected to it.
You see, this is what fascinates me, because the times that we are living in today, we can connect them back to pre-Diluvian times. And of course, that pre-Diluvian, that just means before the flood. And Gary, for me, the flood was almost like a giant reset button being pushed. But I'd love to hear your interpretation of what that pre-Diluvian age was like, because we, in history, we really only get so much of the story. But with you looking across all these scriptures, talk to us about what it was really like.
Yeah, and the Bible is rather stingy on the details of what happened before the flood, not that many verses or chapters. And so we get some hints at what was going on with the descendants of Cain, and with Enoch, and building cities, and with Tubal-Cain and Jubal and Naamah. But we don't get a full indication as to what was really happening. They're only hinting at what is going on. But the Bible isn't written for, secular standards of historians and that. It's written for people about their faith and their tribulations of the Holy Covenant and the people being grafted in. So this is not going to satisfy people like myself when I read these puzzling things that were going on before the flood. And so when you get into the mythologies and into the other religions, they talk about the antediluvian period in a significantly different manner, which brings a lot of things to light. And they talk about a society that was raised to a level of technology that was likely greater than what we have today, if not greater, at least at this level, but my indication from my research would suggest that that technology and that knowledge was developed beyond what we have today. And so this knowledge was based in something that the secret societies talk about and what the Gnostic religions and the polytheist religions will talk about in allegories about this knowledge. But as it's known in the secret societies, it's called the 7 sacred sciences. And this were the basis of knowledge were given to humans by the gods, and that's constant in mythology around the world. Christians would know it as fallen angels. And so this knowledge was taught to Adam first in Eden, but after being ostracized from Eden, he has 2 sons, Cain and Abel, which Abel is murdered by Cain, and Cain becomes ostracized. So Adam now passes on this information to Cain before he's ostracized, and then later Seth. So we have 2 lines going down in prehistory in the Bible for everybody to remember. And then Cain teaches his first son, Enoch, which is, again, very important for people to understand because there are 2 Enochs in the 2 different bloodlines. You have Enoch, son of Cain, and Enoch, son of Jared. And Enoch, son of Jared, is the Holy One that gets raptured to heaven after 365 years. But Cain develops these sciences with Enoch, and Enoch takes it to a whole new level. We get an indication of this with Cain building cities. I'm not going to get into the questions right now as to who he was building them for and why they had to have big walls and all these other things. That's another rabbit hole. But sticking with the development of the technology is Enoch develops this into a polytheist, sun-worshipping, mystical religion that's reflected in places like Atlantis with the wizards and, the Lord of the Rings wizards as well. That's the polytheist, mystical religion that Enoch develops. And he develops the mystical religion and initiation to develop it, and also secret societies within these mystical religions to further develop it and to lead people away from God and to keep it away from the poor and the mundane, because that's why it's an initiatory society for only the elite and specific bloodlines. But they develop these things to such levels that they even take credit for building the pyramids, and whether or not it's the pyramids or it's also Stonehenge, which again Lomas likes to talk about, which is a Freemasonic historian. He wrote a book where he suggests that Enoch, son of Cain, went to England to help build the stone megaliths of Great Britain. And so there's this rich history of this development. And beyond that, it's within the knowledge of prehistory, in the knowledge of mythologies, where we have more than just the corruption of human beings in terms of violence and being led away from God and not giving God any respect for creating the universe, which is what these religions and these secret societies are set up to do with the 7 sacred sciences. But they corrupted the plant life through manipulation of the genome or crossbreeding. They also developed and corrupted animal life. And we have these what seemingly fantastic creations in prehistory, whether or not it's goat-like gods or it's goat-like humans or it's a minotaur or it's a cyclops or it's a Nephilim, as Genesis 6 will talk about, or it's a Pegasus or it's a centaur. This is hinting at more than likely just a copulation, which is talked about in Genesis 6 between the sons of God, the Ben-Ha Elohim, or fallen angels, with human females to create giants. This is probably talking about the level of knowledge that they had to manipulate DNA and to also create all of these types of fantastic beings that we see talked about in all the religions around the world.
And Gary, if I just cut in there, this is really key, because here we do have our first parallel between as the times of Noah and today, because as the listeners, you've heard me often referring to Dr. Craig Venter and him cracking the human genome and even creating synthetic life. Johnny Whistles or somebody last night, I can't remember who, was talking about the fact they're creating embryos from cells that aren't even eggs. So, Gary, this really is a parallel that we can draw between these times.
It is, whether or not it's trying to develop transhumanism with mechanical parts, or it's growing our own organs. The whole idea is to create different beings and also try and create some sort of long-term immortality in the mix. And, you see all of this sort of coming out in science fiction and stuff that is not that far away from the truth, where if they can create a vessel and just transplant this as what we would know as a spirit into that vessel, they can create immortal gods on earth, so to speak, which is kind of what happened with the Nephilim in Genesis 6, at least in the first generation. And so when the Bible talks about the whole earth was corrupted in the times of Noah, this is what we're talking about. And I actually think that not only were humans affected in terms of crossbreeding and DNA manipulation, but all of the plant life and all of the animals for the most part. And it perhaps answers the question why in the Genesis version that God called all the animals to the boat, just as Noah and his family were of pure bloodlines. These were perhaps some of the fewest representatives of those species of that time that were pure of this corruption that were going to repopulate the earth after the flood.
And of course, we've got the seed vaults up in Norway. We've got the mapping every genome of every species on the planet. It makes it sound like they're trying to keep a copy of that pure kind of variation before they go tinkering again. But you mentioned the Nephilim there, Gary, and this is where the audience really want me to take you. Talk to us about these Nephilim, because they keep coming up, and you are one man, I think, that can explain this. Who are they?
Sure.
What are they? And how do they or their bloodline relate to today?
Sure. And let me backtrack just a touch here to set the table for everybody who might be listening. So the idea of the Nephilim is a constant, just as the flood is, just as the little people are, just as pyramids are in pretty much every continent around the world except for in Antarctica, and who knows, maybe even underneath Antarctica, but that's speculation at this point. They all have mythologies and religions that verify these same stories. And so this is a constant. This is the whole prehistoric world kept a oral and then later a written down version of these events in prehistory. And so the Nephilim in the monotheist perspective are the same as the Titans in the Greek mythology or the Anunnaki in the Sumerian mythology, or the Daitia and Ahura and so many other names they have in subcontinent of Indian mythology and around the world. They all have a name for these giants. And in Irish mythology, people look at that as the Tuatha De Danann, as part of that same sort of group of giants that were before the flood. And they came about in Genesis 6, as we're instructed, that the sons of God went to the daughters of humans to copulate and have sex with them, and through that copulation there was this offspring of these heroes of old, men of renown, known as the Nephilim. And of course, people also will refer to them as Gibborim as well, but Gibborim doesn't have to be Nephilim, but that's a little different rabbit hole. But the Gibborim is the heroes of old and the demigods, tyrants, men of war, that whole sort of meaning when you take that back to its ancient Hebrew. And so we have the immortal spirit of the fallen angels being passed on to a new hybrid species being created through this copulation. And so this is why God steps in also in Genesis 6 to limit the age of all beings to a maximum of 120 years, humans and these new hybrids, because with the immortal spirit being passed on to these new hybrids, the Nephilim, they could essentially live forever, even though their bodies could not. They would wear out after a while. And so that's where the demons come from, because the demons are the bodiless spirits of the first generation of the Nephilim. And so when we look at superheroes today, and we see this allegory of Superman, who's got an interesting snake S on him, and is the son of El, we need to understand that these are allegories that are being reflected back to this ancient time of superheroes, men of renown, heroes of old, just as they were called heroes in the Iliad and in the Greek mythology. And if we understand hero in its ancient understanding, as opposed to how we would look at a hero today as just a normal human who does good things or courageous things, they were known as demigods in the ancient world. And so in Genesis 6 now we have this story being played out that is part of the flood story. And there's nothing to separate this from the flood story in Genesis 6. It's the same narrative. And it's these Nephilim that help and partner with the descendants of Cain, the mystical religions, and the secret societies to totally corrupt the antediluvian epoch, and the Nephilim become the kings. They usurp kingship. The descendants of Enoch with the mystical religion, they become the wizards and the priests of this mystical society and this partnership that crosses the flood, and then the knowledge of the seven sacred sciences are developed to help enslave humankind. And so we understand that the first generation and the descendants thereafter, who lived to some very long ages, were demigods and had the immortal spirit and were much larger than humans. Then all of a sudden we have a very, very striking and scary little narrative that's tied to the flood narrative that isn't really discussed a whole bunch about in the Bible.
Wow, I'm sitting here just listening intently, Gary.
Okay, so let's talk about who these Ben Ha-Elohim are. And you notice, as I said, the house of El and Superman and the snake, okay? The snake imagery is so important because that's part of this world legacy as well, just as dragons are. And I'll explain all of this in the book and as we do more shows down the road. But these sons of God were part of a specific order of angels. And some of your audience may be aware of them as the Greek term is Grigori, or as watchers, or as archons, all talking about the same order. And this is the seraphim order of angels that's talked about, and depending on the translation you're talking about in Isaiah 6. Seraphim, Im stands for ones. So these are seraphs, which other translations will have, and seraph was a snake-like being. And so when we look at Lucifer or Satan, he is a dragon and a serpent. And he's part seraphim, and he's also known as cherub. He's a little interesting, different character who is the leader of these rebellious fallen angels who are part of the angelic rebellion and were governing the earth in somewhere between 4 and 9 cultic centers of the ancient world. Most people think about 4 to 7, but there's some narratives out there that might suggest 9 and 7 sacred mountains that are around the world. But back to these seraphim angels. They actually looked like a snake. They had the face of a snake. And you put the wings on a snake-like angelic being, and you have an angelic dragon. Just as in Eden, where you have the serpent who deceives Adam and Eve, and later his voice is taken away, his intelligence is taken away, his feet are taken away, his hands are taken away, and in other testimonies about this, there were more than one form of snakes. Some of them actually had wings. So this was a physical world serpent or dragon that is absolutely runs rampant around the world again and in mythologies. And what's really important about all of this is that look was passed on to the Nephilim. So the early generations of the Nephilim not only were monstrous, but they had the face of a viper.
Wow. Now, let me just stop you there, sir, because we are almost on the break. But just get this, listeners, all the stuff you've been listening to there, winged serpents, dragons, little cherubs, stuff like that. Now, if you go to London today, present day, and walk anywhere in the centre of London, especially around the royal buildings, you are going to see an abundance of stone statues that look just like what Gary's talking about there. Go to Paris, you will see the same things sitting on top of buildings today. And after the break, we're going to be asking Gary how we still see this symbology, what it means, and a whole lot more. Did I promise you a really mind-blowing guest? Raise the bar and then some here on KBS. Gary Wayne live on the show, and we'll be back right after these short messages.
This is the Kev Baker Show.
We are back live on the Truth Frequency Radio Network, and all of you great people out there tonight, you're tuned in live to the Kev Baker Show. We've got a special guest. His name is Gary Wayne, and he is the man behind the book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy. Now, you can find his work over at genesis6conspiracy.com, and that is the digit 6 in the middle. I urge you all to check that out. Please, if you can, get the book as well. It's certainly something I am going to be investing in. Now, before the break, I was sharing with Gary and all of you out there that if you go to the power centres around the world today, let's look at London, Paris, for example, you see structures and stone representations of all the kind of things that Gary is talking about. And it's no accident, folks, because these power centres are all part of the plan that was put in place when these Nephilim came about in the first place. And let's go back to Gary Wayne now to pick it up, because, Gary, I think we do see that power, that bloodline still running the planet today. Would you agree?
Oh, I would definitely agree with that. And when we look at the question is how did this happen? As I mentioned before the break, these Nephilim, they were able to usurp the kingships in partnership with the descendants of Cain and the mystical religion before the flood. But somehow, and we do know that Nephilim do survive the flood because they are listed in the Old Testament as Rephaim or Anakim or Evim or Avim and so many, and Zamzamim, so many different names.
Would it be fair to say that the recent Noah film, that even hints at the fact that they survived the flood, doesn't it?
Yes, and that's a Gnostic religion overlay on the flood story of their account. And they had Tubal-Cain of the Cain line surviving that on the flood. And some people in that sort of genre may actually think that Tubal-Cain is Og, but I think they're two different people from my research.
And of course, Tubal-Cain is where the Freemasons, they absolutely revere this character.
Oh, yeah, he's an artificer of the highest level, especially into metals. I mean, and he is a patriarch, just as Enoch, son of Cain, is a patriarch, just as Nama is a patriarch, just as Jubal, just as Cain is. I mean, they take their society and in their craft legends, and in a book by Albert Mackey, he puts all of this in place, which was, the basis of the Polychronicon in Freemasonry, which is their oral history and traditions of the creation back there. So I'm not making it up when I say secret societies grew up with mysticism, descendants of Cain and Nephilim, and they all partnered in prehistory to destroy the antediluvian world, which they're going to do in the end time. So that is an absolute sort of standard on that aspect of it, if people take the time to do the research on that.
So I like looking into the ancient aliens, Anunnaki, stuff like that. Now, having listened to the first part of the show, Gary, I'm starting to see that this Anunnaki, the ones that came down and carried out DNA manipulation, they say, it's basically just the fallen angels and the Nephilim, right?
Yes, so you've got two types of Anunnaki in Sumerian mythology. You've got the heavenly Anunnaki, and you have the earthborn Anunnaki. Just as in Greek mythology, you have the heavenly Titan and you have the earthborn Titan, and just as in fairy mythology, you have these fairies that come from other planets, which are fallen angels, and you have the earthborn fairies. And so this is just the same story of the fallen angels mating with human females to create these superhuman demigods. And when we talk about the size of these, they were anywhere from 20 to 40 feet tall.
20 to 40 feet.
Yes.
Wow.
And in the first generation. And even Og, depending on whether or not you're talking about a royal cubit or a common cubit, was anywhere from 12 feet to 15 feet tall. And that's after the flood. And so their breadth was also, they were quite a bit wider than what we are. So where you have a height to width ratio on average for a human is about 3 to 1 height to width. It was 2 to 1 for a Nephilim. So hugely stocky and wide, big muscles, fleet of a foot, and looked like snakes. And they're probably 1,500 pounds or bigger. I mean, they were just absolutely monstrous, horrific beings. And somehow they survived the flood. And I'll cover that off on the different options in the book.
A lot of people will get laughed at when we talk about reptilians and things like that, Gary. But I mean, these must have been reptilian in appearance almost.
Well, they did. They had the face of a snake. And if you want to get even down as far as, let's say, 1200 BCE in that sort of range, go to a King Tut museum and go look at a statue at Akhenaten. And if you look at that face of Akhenaten, that has the high cheekbones and the extended chin and the slanted eyes of a snake, let alone his body's pretty weird. And that's with diluted bloodlines all the way through. And Akhenaten is one of those sort of crossroads in this whole bloodline genealogy as one of the last of the pure dragon bloodlines, and that's why he is so famous with the Armana dynasty, and that's why Skoda, who escapes eventually to Spain, and the descendants go to Ireland and then over to Scotland in the mythology, is also part of that sort of whole mythology. And he was known as, the Dragon King. So when we talk about these monsters looking like snakes, this look did transcend over the flood. And just as before the flood, they usurped the kingships. And Nimrod in Babel, I'm just going to backtrack here a second. So when we talk about the days of Noah, just so the audience understands, Noah lived both before and after the flood, like 300-some years after the flood. So this incorporates Babel. So we have to incorporate Nimrod and Babel into the end time that it's probably going to look like the days of Noah, as well as what happened in the antediluvian epoch. But again, when you learn about Babel and Sodom and Gomorrah in detail, you learn it's the same rebellion that's ongoing and the same battle that's going on. But they usurped the kingships. The Nephilim usurped the kingships after the flood. And again, that's where the great dynasties of the world and the royal families are developed from.
And these royal families, Gary, I mean, they are very key to Lucifer's plan, because this bloodline is essential because they intend to bring about an antichrist. Is that right?
Yes, they do. And I'll make the case in the book that they are trying to present the antichrist in the end time with Nephilim bloodlines. And so this is going to be a true antichrist, not only a replacement Christ, but an opposite of Christ. And so when we talk about the royal bloodlines, we're talking about all of the major dynasties that were developed after the flood. And when we look at the Mesopotamian ones, we're talking about obviously Nimrod and the descendants of Nimrod and the Mesopotamian kingships and Chaldea and the Akkadians. We also have the Mitanni dynasty. You also have the Amalekite dynasty. You also have the Hittite dynasty, and you have the Egyptian dynasty. And then as that spreads out, that's where the royal families take their genealogies back to. And in not only Gnosticism, but in the royal families, they do two things that are very, very interesting. One is they keep their genealogies on record all the way back into the mists of time. And according to them and according to the secret societies, they have these genealogies in place that take them back to the Nephilim and the fallen angels. The second thing that they do is they try and intermarry as much as possible within those royal bloodlines to keep the bloodlines as pure as possible. Pure as possible in terms of keeping that DNA, that type of blood that goes back to their ancient parents. And so we have to understand that this tradition of marrying within the family is a Nephilim tradition to maintain their bloodlines throughout history and to enslave humankind, which they've been trying to do all along, whether or not it was before the flood, after the flood at Babel, after the flood at Sodom, all throughout history, and what they're going to do, try and do again in the end time with their Nephilim Antichrist.
And Gary, we have got the best example ever over here with our royal family, because if we go back to the union between Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer, it was because of her blood. That is what made her so rare. For whatever reason, Gary, something was getting diluted, but they needed a fresh injection of that Nephilim gene.
They do, and they try, even though they go further out in the bloodlines, to be able to get that mix. I mean, there is always this constant dilution, which is why they don't look like the giants of old, right? Because otherwise you just have developed all of these genetic problems. And Lady Di, I mean, she goes back, I believe, on her mother's side to the Stuart dynasty, which is one of the most significant crossroad dynasties in history and in this sort of whole sort of plot of bloodlines. It was called the Unicorn Dynasty, and I'm sure everybody in Scotland knows all about the Stuarts, of course. But she connects back there, but it's this whole idea that they're still keeping the bloodlines within the bloodlines as best as they can.
Absolutely. So on you go, Gary.
And this is also, the bloodline aspect is known by a few different sort of allegories, and one of them is a Rosicrucian allegory, which is called Vril, V-R-I-L, something in the blood. And they believe that within these bloodlines and this certain blood, they can recreate these Nephilim of old, these giants, these demigods, and the Nazis were trying to work it in a similar way through genetics and breeding to create the super race. And when you learn about the Nazis, you understand they were absolutely burgeoning with this occult belief system.
Gary, you're just too good, because you're stealing all of my good questions here. I'm writing down Nazis and Vril, and you go and steal it from me. This is amazing.
Well, it's all part of the connection, and some people will look at that as, is that the RH negative bloodline? And I know the royals don't put their bloodlines out, but somewhere RH was inserted into human bloodlines, and nobody's really sure how. I'm sure they know how, they're just not telling us how. It's a possibility that it's the RH negative bloodline, and they also need, I think, the O bloodline to match up when they get into trouble, because RH has trouble giving birth, as what most people understand. So they need to find a way to be able to keep reproducing.
And for all the listeners out there, don't worry that we're kind of hitting topics and then flying on segues to others, because I've already shamelessly asked Gary to come and join us for a Freaky Friday. This is the perfect kind of guest for a 3-hour conversation. Joe Joseph, he will be absolutely falling off his chair with some of the information you're sharing here tonight. But we touched on the Nazis there. We often talk about the bell on this program. And I think that's a good segue into alien mythology. Now, why do I go to alien mythology? Well, because our guest, Gary Wayne, he can connect that to everything we're talking about. So how does this alien mythology all fit in, Gary?
Well, the first thing is when you learn about alien mythology, and I'm sure everybody's familiar with Ancient Aliens on the History Channel, is this is not a secular belief system, even though they try and sparse it. It is, again, this polytheist belief system. They just spin it that these ancient aliens weren't as high on the sort of the God level. But just so we understand that they're talking about the same story, but they have a different perspective. And when we look at the alien mythology going throughout history, you have so much of it being recalled in ancient history, whether or not there's diagrams of space people or spaceships or whatever, and wherever these ancient aliens or these gods came from in the alien mythos. But what's really interesting is that it connects into the different types of beings that were in the ancient world. And I talked about the fairies, and the fairies have 4 different classifications to them, and the 4th classification is the elementals. And in the elementals, you have the gnomes, which are kind of ugly ones, and there's several different variations under the gnomes. You also have the leprechauns, which are the sort of the mischievous ones, and then you have the little people, which are, the good-looking ones, and also splits into Norse fairy mythology, like Tolkien gets into when he gets into the Lord of the Rings, which is telling the same ancient history, or the sort of the British or the European, and they're very much connected, but they have sort of their own vernacular, different flavors to it. But what's interesting about the alien is a Christian will for the most part, look at alien as demonic and fallen angels and a deception. And I agreed to that, but I would also agree that we need to take the testimony out of prehistory and understand there are other different beings. And within this subset of elementals, and you see all these little people, whether it's in Shakespeare or it's in Atlantis mythology or in the Lord of the Rings, these people in their belief system were there in the ancient times, in the antediluvian world, as part of these other corrupted beings that were created. And they have difficulty in populating as well, just as the descendants of the Nephilim do. But these are little people. And even the native North Americans have 3 different classifications of little people. So again, this is a world sort of standard, and little people have mythologies and part of the religions all around the world, just as the rest of the story does. But within this one classification under gnomes, there's the little grays in your neck of the woods that had flying machines and great technology, and would kidnap people for a fortnight, and then people would come back without any sort of memory as to what happened. Well, what's interesting about these little grays, and I'll give a example of that in my book. If you didn't know I was talking about a fairy abduction, you would swear we were talking about a gray alien abduction.
I was just going to say, I mean, that is the definition of what we would call an alien abduction today.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's identical. And so when you get into this sort of research, you quickly understand that the little people were there assisting the Nephilim and the mystery religions and the development of the sciences, and the gnomes, which are also the basis for the word gnosis, which Gnosticism comes from. They were the genealogists and the record keepers. And so this has a significant place in history, and part of the alien mythology is coming through portals with these spaceships.
Did you just say portals there?
Yes.
Wow, now this is something we often talk about on the show. Talk to us about what your interpretation of these portals are, Gary.
Well, from another dimension, whether or not it's across the universe, which I don't think so, as in a wormhole. I'm talking about a portal from a different universe completely, or a different dimension. And so when we talk about portals where these spaceships come through, they generally come through underwater, but not 100%, but a lot of them come through water portals. And so when we talk about the fairy aspect and the connection, whether or not we have the Shays in Scotland, or we have the in the Grail mythologies of the Ladies of the Lake, which are fairies, there's this, and whether or not we have these fairy dolmens that are located around the world, and dolmen stands for portal, and those are like mini sort of Stonehenge megaliths if people haven't heard of these before, and it's spelled Dolman, dolmen, and they're called fairy dolmens. These are known as portals where beings come from another dimension. And so when you have fairy flying machines coming from fairy portals and fairies guarding these portals, you have now, and you have descriptions that are identical to the gray aliens as one part of the alien mythos, because in the mythos there are different beings and different sort of hierarchy of the alien mythos. And I'm not talking that I necessarily believe the alien mythos, I'm just relaying part of the information to encapsulate the context here. There's a connection here between the fairies and the Nephilim and the ancient organization structures and fallen angels and demons and what we're seeing as a phenomena today, because it seems to be very much an identical story.
This is amazing. Now, we often cover the Large Hadron Collider on here, Gary. And what does it mean to you when the top scientists in the world are saying that they're literally opening portals to other dimensions? Because after listening to you tonight, well, it really does sound like they're trying to bring back some of these demonic entities through these portals for this time.
Yeah, and they're using what, again, people may not be aware of, but maybe off your show they are, something called a quantum computer.
Oh, yes. The D-wave is the one that we concentrate on.
Right, and so that is one of the locations where the quantum computers is only, half a dozen or 5 or 6 around the world that I'm aware of anyways, in conjunction with this. So they're not just trying to create the spark that created the universe. They're trying to get into other dimensions, which, the quantum mechanics allows them to play with that, at least on a subatomic level.
And Gary, when the creator of that quantum computer stands and tells the audience that it's basically like standing at an altar to an alien god, he isn't really lying then, is he? Because it could well be that he is talking to things in other dimensions like we're talking about tonight.
Exactly. And one of the dimensions that, people are afraid of is that they're trying to get into the abyss that's recorded in Revelation, that is a prison for the impassioned fallen angels who created the Nephilim and who helped destroy the world with the first apocalypse by water, and the most horrific of the demons that they want to bring these beings back out to introduce the end time.
And Joy in the chat room says, this looks like this is all coming full circle for the end times. And I think I would agree with that, Gary. What do you say?
Well, yeah. Let's take Babel. And let me connect Babel here for you just quickly. And at Babel, you hear about the tower and the walls being built. And this is an example of the 7 sacred sciences, because the 5th science is masonry or geometry. But in the craft, they like to call it masonry. So this was the first physical manifestation of rediscovering with Hermes and Nimrod partnering to develop the 7 sacred sciences. But Babel, and God says, and as in the Bible, just so that people can get sort of, again, a glimpse of the type of knowledge here, is speaking as one people and one language and working together. Nothing they want to do will be held back. That's the power of this knowledge. So he confuses the language. And the typical understanding of Babel is Hebrew, which is confusion, right? But Nimrod, he goes off to, after Babel, to Chaldea and develops that civilization, and from which the Akkadians come. And so Babel in Akkadian is separated into Bab and El. And as people may have been aware from what I said earlier in the show, El stands for a son of God, or God in this case, and Bab stands for gateway. So Babel was a gateway to the gods. They were trying to bring these fallen angels back somehow at Babel to recreate Nephilim.
And absolutely. And so, you're blowing my mind here. You truly are. Now, can I ask you quickly, Nimrod, was he a giant?
Yeah, and I'll just talk about that. I just wanted to bring out the Babel thing in connection with CERN and the abyss and what happened in the antediluvian world. Now, a lot of people think that Nimrod was a giant. Now, he was a large man. He's actually called Gibra in the Hebrew language of the original translation of the Old Testament, but he was still human. He was not Nephilim. And even the Freemasons say he was like a giant, but he wasn't a giant. And even I know there's legends out there that suggest he's giant. One of the things that if you follow sort of some certain disciplines like I try and do is that if you follow the Table of Nations in First Chronicles and Genesis, it'll give all the descendants of Noah. And Nimrod is the son of Cush, son of Ham. Okay, so we have his genealogy. But afterwards we don't. So something happens there, and he intermarries into the giants and is part of this kingship bloodline after Babel. And he makes his name against fighting not only his own people to usurp them, but also fighting giants. So he's Gibberim, and he's a tyrant, but he's not Nephilim because we have his genealogy. Now Rapha, who is the father of the Raphaim, or Arba, who's the father of the Anakim in the Old Testament, they're not in the Table of Nations. And so anybody who marries in with the giants afterwards or are not from Noah, they're not listed in the Table of Nations. And so I think because of that, and I make the case in the book in a lot more detail that Nimrod, he acted like a Nephilim, he partnered with them, he brought in their mystical religion, which is the Enochian religion that they found off the two pillars of Lamech, which is the two pillars that are up in the temple of Masonry, even though they call them Boaz and Joachim, as the lower level initiative allegory. But he was essentially acting like a Nephilim and the first sort of Antichrist figure of the post-Diluvian world, which is why Babel or Babylon is the religion of the end time that's coming.
Wow, Gary. Not many guests can blow me away, sir, but my head is absolutely melting. My Facebook is going mad. The chat room, they love you, and I'm so glad that you're going to be able to come back sometime soon. But before you go, just a quick shout-out to where people can see your work and the book.
Okay. So I've got a website called the Genesis 6 Conspiracy. That's Genesis 6 with the number 6. And I've got an extensive excerpt on every chapter on that website. So if you want to get a good look at it,